The money was laid out on a church basement table like a body. $50,000. Not in bank envelopes. Not in neat legal boxes. Just thick, ugly stacks of cash under yellow light, bound with rubber bands, the edges worn soft from too many fearful hands. Men stared at it without speaking. Women who had known hunger stared harder. In one corner, somebody's child had been told to stay quiet and could not understand why every grown face in the room looked like Sunday and funeral at the same time. And standing 3 feet from that table, with his collar open and his mouth gone dry, was the man who had sold Bumpy Johnson for every one of those dollars. Some people say he was shaking. Some say he looked almost relieved, because by then shame had finally become lighter than fear. Some say the only sound in the room was the buzz of those bad basement lights and the faint scrape of his shoe against concrete as he realized too late that he had not walked into a meeting. He had walked into judgment. No guns on the table. No loud threats. No theatrical cruelty. That was what made it worse. Because Harlem knew what usually happened to men who betrayed a figure like Bumpy Johnson. People expected blood, not bookkeeping. They expected alleyway vengeance, not a basement full of widows, old soldiers, church women, and boys too young to understand why everybody suddenly hated the smell of money. But Bumpy was not in Harlem that year. That's what made the story stick. In 1955, he was far from the avenues that made him feared. Locked away. Federal walls. Cold steel. Time measured by doors, routines, and silence. A legend in a cage, which is exactly why so many men made the same mistake when they thought about him. They assumed prison had made him absent. Harlem knew better. And the man in that basement, the friend, the traitor, the one who thought $50,000 could buy him a second life, was about to learn that Bumpy's most dangerous reach had never been his hands. It was memory. It was loyalty. It was the part of a neighborhood that still organized itself around names strong enough to outlive proximity. The details of the story shift depending on who tells it. In some versions, the traitor was called Red Mason. In others, Sunnyvale. In still others, people would wave off the exact name as if the man had forfeited the right to keep one. But every version agrees on 3 things. He had been close. The amount was $50,000. And what happened after the betrayal did more than punish one man. It reminded Harlem that Bumpy Johnson was still Bumpy Johnson, even from behind a wall. To understand why the betrayal landed so hard, you have to understand what friendship meant in that world, and what it did not mean. Underworld friendship was never soft. It wasn't 2 boys on a stoop sharing dreams and growing old clean together. It was sharper than that. It was built out of childhood scraps, old beatings, shared winters, street debts, funerals, envelopes, rescue, silence, errands done without question, and nights when one man knew another could have let him die and chose not to. That kind of history doesn't make men innocent. It makes them inseparable in the mind. And Bumpy, for all the darkness around him, inspired that sort of loyalty in certain people. Not from everybody. Never everybody. Some feared him. Some used him. Some admired him because they had to translate survival into admiration to live with the rest of it. But there were a few men around him, over the years, who moved like satellites that had forgotten what it was like to orbit anything else. The friend in this story was one of those men. Call him Red Mason. Not because the name is carved in court record somewhere, but because legends need a face, and Harlem always remembered him as a man with reddish-brown skin, a fast smile, and the kind of eyes that made you think he was always halfway between gratitude and grievance. Red had known Bumpy before Bumpy was a myth in the neighborhood and before Harlem learned to say his name with that mixture of pride and caution reserved for complicated kings. Back when men still had to prove themselves up close. Back when the street could still strip the glamour off a reputation in one ugly night. He wasn't Bumpy's equal. Almost nobody was. But he had been near enough, long enough, to earn something rarer than rank. Trust. And trust, in Bumpy's world, was a more expensive commodity than heroin, numbers, or guns. Red had carried money. Red had carried names. Red had known which wives got envelopes on Thursdays and which mothers were to be helped before they asked. Red knew the side doors. The second apartments. The quiet rooms. He knew how Bumpy liked things counted and how he liked bad news delivered. He knew when not to speak. He knew that some instructions sounded simple only because the consequences of misunderstanding them were so heavy nobody dared mishear. Years earlier, when Red had landed in trouble of his own, a knife matter, some ugly debt, a bad idea involving men who did not forgive late payments, it was Bumpy who had pulled him back from the edge. Bumpy didn't save men with speeches. He saved them by making one phone call, paying one sum, sending one car, or deciding one life was still worth more to him breathing than broken. Red never forgot that. Which is why the betrayal cut deeper than a business dispute ever could. Harlem in 1955 was a neighborhood under pressure from every direction. The old numbers economy still breathed through beauty parlors, barber shops, lunch counters, and back rooms, but there was more poison in the streets now. More federal heat. More downtown interest. More young men mistaking disorder for opportunity. More respectable people praying for stability while depending, secretly or otherwise, on underworld order to keep certain kinds of chaos from climbing the stairs and knocking at their own doors. And over all of it floated the fact that Bumpy was gone. Not dead. Gone. Sent away on narcotics charges, sentenced, buried in the federal system, spending years in places where America liked to send dangerous men and then pretend geography was the same thing as erasure. He served much of that sentence at Alcatraz, and the distance alone made people careless. The papers could write as if Harlem had moved on. Downtown men could talk as if the old order had finally become manageable. Younger crews could imagine themselves inheriting what they had never built. But neighborhoods do not move on simply because a powerful man is physically removed. Not neighborhoods like Harlem. Not when the man's name has become stitched into rent, memory, intimidation, protection, revenge, and the ugly little practical systems by which people survive. Bumpy's absence created a vacuum, yes, but not an empty one. More like a room where everyone could still feel the furniture in the dark. And during that absence, men like Red became essential. He wasn't the boss. He wasn't the symbol. He wasn't the one old-timers invoked when they wanted the room to go tight. But he was one of the keepers of continuity. One of the men trusted to make sure the money still moved where it needed to move, the loyal household still got fed, and the people who had stayed true during prison years didn't start thinking prison was the same as abandonment. That role can be noble for a while. Then it curdles. Because the second man in a legend's orbit lives a strange life. He gets proximity to power, but not the full privileges of it. He carries secrets and risks without owning the myth those things protect. He's known, but not revered. Feared a little, maybe. Respected in a secondary way. But always measured against the absent man whose name can still do what his cannot. That gets into a man. Especially a man like Red, who had once told himself loyalty was just another form of delayed reward. At first, he wore the burden well. He moved through Harlem with the seriousness of somebody guarding an inheritance that didn't belong to him but might one day include him. He made sure certain wives received their envelopes untouched. He handled small disputes. He kept the younger idiots from getting too theatrical. When a club owner got nervous about continuing payments while Bumpy was inside, Red sat with him for an hour and left with the arrangement intact and the owner sweating politely into his napkin. But years wear down men who live too close to somebody else's gravity. People noticed changes in him. The suits got better before the money justified them. The drinks got heavier. He began lingering when people praised Bumpy, not joining in, not objecting, just standing there with that unreadable stillness men use when they feel themselves disappearing inside another person's legend. He started taking insult where none was intended. Bumpy would have handled it different, one old man said one night after a sloppy collection dispute. The sentence wasn't even meant as disrespect. Just nostalgia dressed as advice. But Red heard it and went cold behind the eyes. Of course Bumpy would have handled it different. Bumpy handled everything different. That was the problem. Red had spent years making sure the machinery did not fall apart while the owner of the machinery sat inside a federal cage, and still the neighborhood talked as if he were no more than a placeholder holding a coat that did not belong to him. Meanwhile, the streets were changing in ways nobody could ignore. Downtown interests were sniffing around harder. Federal men were pressing certain channels. The Italians still did business where it suited them, but business in New York is never just business. It's memory. insult, territory, race, permission, invisible contracts. And once enough people think a black power center is weakened, somebody from downtown always gets the idea that they're not just buying in. They're restoring order. That was the season when Red was approached. Not in a dark alley with a gun. Not by some cartoon villain counting dirty bills under a street lamp. No. Because betrayal worth $50,000 never starts ugly. It starts flattering. The first contact came through a man Red already half knew, which is how these things always happen. A small operator from downtown with a silk scarf, ring-heavy fingers, and the kind of smile that turned you cold because it never quite settled in one place. He was called Vincent DeMarco in one version of the story, Nino in another, but again the exact name matters less than the role. He was a bridge man. The kind who crossed between Italians, club owners, politicians, bookmakers, and anyone else wealthy enough to require dirt but cowardly enough not to collect it personally. He didn't threaten Red. He complimented him. That was the bait. "You've been doing strong work up there," he said over lunch one gray afternoon in a midtown restaurant that treated black presence like tolerated weather. A lot of men fold under dead weight. "You kept things breathing." Red heard the phrase and bristled a little. Dead weight. DeMarco lifted one shoulder. Not personal. Just practical. Prison freezes some men in other people's imagination. Out here, time keeps charging interest. Red should have walked out right there. Instead he stayed. Because the line reached the most dangerous place inside him, the place where loyalty and resentment had been sleeping shoulder to shoulder for too long. DeMarco kept the conversation light. No ask on the first sit down. That's another rule of real seduction. If you go straight for the betrayal, men can still feel the shape of their own conscience. Better to begin with sympathy. Recognition. The promise that somebody sees the labor under the legend. "You ever get tired," DeMarco asked, cutting into veal with delicate ease, "of carrying a whole neighborhood's nerves for a man who ain't here?" Red drank, didn't answer. DeMarco smiled slightly. "I only ask because men downtown notice who's actually doing the work." There it was. Downtown notices you. That sentence has broken more decent instincts than greed ever has. From there, the attention became gradual. Another lunch. A better bottle. A conversation in a club too elegant for Red's usual budget where nobody made him feel like he was sitting in somebody else's chair. Then a meeting with a bigger man, Salvatore Rizzo in some tellings, Frankie Marino in others, always described the same way: smooth voice, winter eyes, authority worn lightly enough to be mistaken for patience. Rizzo didn't insult Bumpy. Men at his level knew better than to disrespect a name like that without utility. He spoke in the language of transition. He talked about Harlem's future. About business consolidation. About stability under new conditions. About how neighborhoods built on personalities eventually get hurt by those personalities when they disappear. Then he spoke directly to Red. "There's a difference between being trusted and being trapped." Red said nothing. Rizzo leaned back. "You're too useful to die holding somebody else's memories." That line stayed with Red long after the meeting ended. Because that was the hook, wasn't it? Not just money. Recognition. Independence. A life no longer built around holding place for a man who, to all appearances, might never return the same. The $50,000 came later, after the idea had already done its work. And when it came clean enough to feel respectable. Not a suitcase shoved across a table like a cheap film. An offer broken into logic. Information. Access. Assurance. They wanted certain things. Not everything. No one asks for everything. Too obvious. Too frightening. They wanted the names of the most reliable collectors still loyal to Bumpy's old network. They wanted the locations of 2 fallback cash reserves used to support imprisoned men's families and maintain neighborhood obligations. They wanted to know who, among Harlem's old guard, was still emotionally reachable and who would have to be cut out more forcefully. They wanted the quiet roots, the real roots, not the ones police watched or newspaper boys fantasized about. And for that, Red would receive $50,000 and guaranteed protection under new arrangements. Protection. That word means more to a man in Red's position than people admit. Men like him don't just crave wealth. They crave insulation from the exact thing their old loyalties once required them to endure. The offer was enough to start a new life. Enough to buy distance. Enough to turn a helper into a principal if he moved correctly afterward. Enough to tell himself that he was not betraying Bumpy so much as adapting before everybody else admitted adaptation was necessary. That is how traitors usually survive their own minds. They rename the act. They don't say betrayal. They say inevitability. They say transition. They say business. They say if not me, someone else. They say the old man would have understood if the old man were honest. They say prison changes everything. Red said all of those things to himself and still didn't sleep well for a week. He walked Harlem longer than usual during those nights. Past bars where his name still meant something, past churches where old women in hats would greet him as if respectability could still be borrowed by association, past apartments where mothers waited on money he was partly responsible for delivering. He could feel the neighborhood asking him a question without ever saying it aloud. Who are you when the man you serve is gone? For years his answer had been simple. I am the man still serving. But the 50,000 had changed the question. Now it sounded more like this. How long do you plan to die loyal on another man's behalf? He took the money. Not all at once. In arrangements. In layers. Enough to preserve deniability for 3 days, maybe 4, if God himself had been bored enough to audit the thing. And once he took it, he crossed the line men always cross faster than they expect. Because the first secret is the hardest to hand over. The second comes easier. By the third, you are no longer protecting anything except your right to call the first one reasonable. He gave them a ledger key. Then a name. Then a location. Then the confirmation that yes, one of the family funds they wanted was not merely rumor, and yes, the households receiving money still mattered enough to Harlem that disrupting them would send a signal louder than any headline. That last part was where Red truly damned himself. Selling Bumpy alone would have been one thing. Ugly enough. Dangerous enough. But selling the fund that kept prison wives, aging mothers, and loyal households afloat? That was another category of sin. In Harlem, men could forgive violence faster than they could forgive starvation by betrayal. The first visible sign of damage came quietly. A woman named Miss Evie, whose husband had died keeping his mouth shut on a case that could have benefited plenty of selfish men, went to collect the envelope she was owed and found the usual route broken. No explanation. Just delay. Delay in neighborhoods like Harlem could feel like cold hands around the throat. Rent did not delay. Grocers did not delay. Children's needs certainly did not. Then another household missed theirs. And another. Word moved. The trouble with family money is that once it stops, the women notice before the men admit anything's wrong. They notice because money translated directly into groceries, shoes, medicine, rent, grace, dignity. Men can talk in abstractions. Women see the cabinet shelves. Within 48 hours, a handful of Harlem homes were feeling consequences from a betrayal most of them couldn't yet name. That's when suspicion started looking for a face. Red's own behavior did the rest. He tried not to flash at first, but money wants to be seen. Especially money a man has spent years telling himself he deserves. He upgraded his suits too quickly. Started drinking in places that cost more than his old rhythm justified. Picked up a watch with a face too bright for a man supposedly straining to maintain prison-era obligations. There's no such thing as secret wealth in a neighborhood trained to measure everyone. Old women noticed. Barbers noticed. Bookmakers noticed. Boys who hung around corners noticed and whispered before they fully understood what they were observing. One night Red walked into a card room where he had been treated like a working son of the neighborhood for years. He laid down cash in a way that was meant to look casual and succeeded only in looking new. Curtis Bell, a man old enough to have survived every fashion in New York except honesty, watched him for a long while and finally said, "You spending like somebody left you an inheritance." Red smiled thinly. "Maybe I earned one." Curtis held his gaze. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." The table laughed uneasily, because everybody smelled something now. Not proof. Just wrongness. Meanwhile, far away from the neighborhood but never fully disconnected from it, Bumpy Johnson heard the first tremor of the betrayal. People imagine news reaching a man in prison like a dramatic scene in a movie. It's rarely that clean. More often it comes in fragments. A look held too long during a visit. A phrase in a letter that says more through what it omits. A lawyer suddenly asking about a route he never cared about before. A wife who is trying to protect you and therefore tells the truth more carefully than usual. However it came, every version agrees on this. Bumpy understood the shape of the problem before he knew the full outline. That was his gift. He could hear one missing note and infer the cracked instrument. If the story follows the most common Harlem telling, it came through Mamie first, not the whole betrayal, not with names right away, but with enough pain around the edges to make plain that something beyond normal prison attrition had occurred. A fund interrupted. Families worried. The wrong people suddenly asking the right questions. Somebody downtown leaning with knowledge they had not earned. Bumpy listened. Then he asked the question everybody remembered because it showed exactly where his priorities still lived. Who went hungry? Not how much was taken. Not who disrespected him. Not even who talked. Who went hungry? That was Bumpy at his most complicated and most dangerous. For all the criminality, for all the violence bound up in the life he had built, he understood that a neighborhood tolerates you differently when your betrayal lands first on women and children. That was not merely theft. That was desecration. Mamie, or the lawyer, or whichever trusted bridge you prefer in the legend, started naming households. Miss Evie. Mrs. Tolbert. Old Man Harris's daughter. 2 wives whose men were still doing time. A grandmother on 137th who never asked for charity because the envelopes were not charity. They were owed. Bumpy sat very still. People around truly dangerous men often misread stillness. They think quiet means shock or restraint or sorrow. Sometimes it means the mind has gone so deep into the machinery of consequence that ordinary movement would only slow it down. He asked one more question. Who knows? Not everybody, came the answer. He looked up then. By tomorrow, he said, everybody should. That might sound reckless to people who don't understand neighborhoods. Why spread your own vulnerability? Why let Harlem know the family funds had been hit? Because Bumpy understood something many bosses never do. When you are betrayed through private criminal channels, you can still contain the damage. When you are betrayed through obligations the whole neighborhood recognizes as sacred, containment becomes your enemy. The more people know, the more the betrayer loses places to stand. He did not ask for immediate violence. That part matters. He asked for light. And light, in Harlem, could be a deadlier punishment than bullets. The next days moved the way weather moves in a city with narrow streets. Not all at once. Not everywhere equally. But enough for anyone paying attention to feel the pressure drop. Word got out that some prison families had been touched. That money meant for old loyalties had gone sideways. That somebody on the inside of Bumpy's circle had sold air from the house itself. No one said Red's name loudly at first. That's how names get condemned in serious neighborhoods. Indirectly. People begin speaking around you in a way that turns your own ears into accusers. Red felt it. At first he told himself it was nothing. A bartender taking longer than usual to pour his drink. A woman he'd known for years suddenly declining to sit too close. A collector who usually slapped his shoulder now barely nodding. A deacon's wife across the avenue pausing her conversation just long enough for him to understand he had entered the subject and not the room. He tried to tough it out. He spent more. Laughed bigger. Moved like a man unconcerned. But guilt has terrible posture, and communities have expert eyes. Then came the first direct test. Red entered Miss Pearl's luncheonette just after noon. The place was narrow, honest, and older than his best lies. People there knew everybody's mothers, who was sick, whose son had come home, and which men were pretending their troubles were temporary. Miss Pearl had served him coffee on credit in leaner years. That day, when he took his usual stool, she looked at him once and said, "We don't have it." Red glanced toward the pot. "Don't have what?" "Anything for you." He laughed, because men laugh when humiliation hits them before they've prepared a face. "Come on, Pearl." She wiped the counter without looking at him. "You heard me." People in the room did not turn. That was the cruelty of it. Nobody needed spectacle. The refusal itself was enough. Red leaned closer. You really doing this over rumors? Miss Pearl finally met his eyes. Rumors don't empty widow pockets, she said. That was the first time the betrayal struck him not as a private danger but as a public identity. He walked out with every eye in the room carefully refusing to follow him. Harlem was starting to choose. That should have driven him to confession. Instead, fear drove him deeper into self-preservation. He ran back downtown, back toward the men who had purchased his future and therefore, he believed, were obligated to secure it. DeMarco received him in the kind of office that always smells faintly of cigars, polished wood, and fake permanence. Red tried to sound angry, but anger without leverage usually comes out as pleading with sharp corners. The neighborhood knows. DeMarco shrugged. Neighborhoods always know something. No, Red said. They know. DeMarco's expression barely shifted. Then stop walking around like you expect a parade. You said I'd be protected. I said you'd be compensated. Same thing. DeMarco smiled in a way that made the room feel smaller. No. Compensation is money. Protection is status. You still have to earn that. Red stared at him. I gave you everything you asked. DeMarco's voice cooled. Then maybe you should have kept something. There it was. The first real taste of betrayal's second law. The people who buy a traitor never trust him after purchase. Why would they? A man who sells one house may sell another. A man who breaks one oath for money has introduced money as the highest authority in his life. After that, no one shakes his hand without also checking where their own wallet went. Red left that office with $50,000 attached to his name and almost no real shelter behind it. Back in Harlem, Bumpy's response continued taking shape, not as eruption, but as design. The first message he sent, according to the oldest version of the story, was simple enough to memorize in one hearing. Do not touch him. Let the neighborhood do that. That line stunned some of the younger men around Bumpy's orbit. They expected harder instruction. They wanted the clean simplicity of violent revenge. A body. A river. A headline whispered but never printed. Something that would satisfy the crude math of betrayal. But Bumpy knew betrayal by a friend is not only an offense. It is a teaching moment, if you understand power the right way. A dead traitor can become a cautionary tale. A living traitor forced to endure the neighborhood's judgment becomes something worse. He becomes a mirror. And Bumpy wanted Harlem to see itself in the punishment. Not just fear him. Understand the code. So he sent out no war cry. He sent out understanding. The women whose envelopes had been interrupted were quietly told the shortage would be corrected. The older men still holding Bumpy's line were told not to swing first. Barbers, bartenders, landlords, store owners, numbers writers, runners, club owners, girls who moved between tables and heard everything, church ladies who knew which blocks were rotting and which were still salvageable, they all got the same moral update in different language. Red didn't steal from Bumpy. He stole from the house. That distinction mattered. Because plenty of respectable Harlem residents wanted no romance with gangsters whatsoever. They had buried sons, prayed against vice, cursed the damage men like Bumpy brought. But even they understood the horror of a trusted insider selling out households that had already paid enough for underworld loyalty. The betrayal offended more than criminals. It offended the neighborhood's sense of debt. And once that happened, Red's life began shrinking in real time. His barber said the chair was full. The landlord of a place he used for private company suddenly doubled concerns about new attention. A girl he had been buying gifts for took the bracelet and still refused the apartment key. A driver quit. Without warning. One numbers writer returned his money unopened. At a poker table downtown, two Italians laughed when he entered and kept laughing after he sat down. That laughter hurt more than any shouted accusation. Because it told him the truth he had been running from. He had not become important. He had become useful. Those are not the same thing, and men often learn the difference only after the bill has been paid. Still, the 50,000 remained real. You cannot tell a desperate man that cash is an illusion when he can hold it. Touch it. Count it. Buy whiskey and watches and false confidence with it. So Red kept trying to use the money to outrun the social death creeping up his back. He rented better rooms. Started talking about Philadelphia, maybe Jersey, maybe Miami if the right chain came together. Told people he was done being local. Told one woman, Harlem thinks too small. I'm thinking bigger. But Harlem heard bigger and translated it correctly. He sold us and now wants altitude. Then came the night that cracked him. He stopped by Miss Evie's building on 138th without fully understanding why. Maybe guilt pulled him. Maybe memory. Maybe he wanted to tell himself the damage wasn't personal, just structural, just one ugly shift in the game. Maybe he wanted to see whether the consequences had really reached the faces Bumpy had asked about. He climbed the stairs with a bag of groceries he had paid for himself, as if private generosity could repair public betrayal. Miss Evie opened the door only halfway. She had the look of a woman too tired to hate theatrically. On the table behind her sat unpaid bills, a child's school shoes with the soles thinning, and the exact kind of domestic strain criminals never talk about honestly when they discuss loyalty. Red held up the bag. Brought something. She stared at it. Then at him. From which pocket? He swallowed. Evie, listen. No, she said. You listen. Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. My husband kept his mouth shut when keeping it shut cost him his life. I buried him with help from men you worked for. If the money stopped because the law found it, that's one thing. If the money stopped because the world turned colder, that's one thing too. But if it stopped because somebody sold the way to our door. She looked him over then, not with outrage, but with a kind of exhausted disgust that cut deeper because it refused spectacle. Then groceries ain't groceries, she said. Their apology wearing a paper bag. She shut the door in his face. That was the moment the money began to feel poisoned even in his own hands. Some betrayals stay abstract until you see the child they touched. From then on, Red started unraveling. He drank more, but less gracefully. He checked over his shoulder in rooms that had once relaxed for him. He demanded reassurance from people unimportant enough to lie and too powerless to make the lie matter. He returned to DeMarco twice in 3 days and was put off both times by secretaries and silence. He tried to see Rizzo and was told the man was unavailable. Unavailable, to someone who had sold his soul for their favor. That should tell you how final the demotion already was. Meanwhile, Bumpy continued saying very little, which only enlarged the legend. People expected fury and got structure. They expected chaos and got choreography. Some say Bumpy sent a second instruction around Harlem. If he returns the money, take it. If he asks for forgiveness, don't answer for me. That line sounds like something he would say, hard, unsentimental, leaving room for others to reveal themselves without granting the traitor the comfort of direct absolution. Because that was the true punishment now, Red was being forced to live inside the distance between what he wanted and what the neighborhood was prepared to give. And then one more thing happened, something Red never anticipated. The downtown men started worrying about him. Not because they loved morality. Because they loved insulation. The more Harlem turned on Red, the more dangerous he became to the men who had purchased him. Isolated traitors start talking. Scared men with nothing left often remember how much they know. DeMarco could smell that possibility before Red himself fully understood it. A man who has already betrayed once is never a finished transaction. He is a future risk. So the phones began not getting answered. The door people began forgetting he was expected. A car once promised to him for a trip out of town failed to appear. One envelope that was supposed to contain the next stage of his relocation money contained instead a polite note saying future arrangements were delayed. Delayed. That word again. Always the same word when power is deciding whether to cut you loose. Red finally understood what was happening. Harlem hated him. Downtown did not trust him. And the only man whose pardon might have saved him was the man he had sold. That realization does things to the spine. You can see it in men before they say a word. Their shoulders begin negotiating with gravity differently. Their confidence loses angles. Their hands start checking for cigarettes that aren't there. He sent word uptown asking for a sit-down. No answer. He sent a second message through a woman who used to know one of Bumpy's cousins. No answer. He tried using an old phrase that once would have opened the right backroom door. Tell him Red wants to make the books right. The answer that came back was brief. The books know already. That one nearly broke him. Because it told him Bumpy was not only aware. He was uninterested in bargaining from the old emotional ground. Whatever friendship had existed was no longer a private subject between two men. It had become arithmetic in the eyes of the neighborhood. And the total was against him. By then the church basement meeting had not yet happened, but its shape was already forming. Not from dramatic plotting, but from necessity. The family funds had to be restored. Publicly enough to reassure the neighborhood. Carefully enough to preserve order. Morally enough to make the lesson unmistakable. Somebody, an auntie, a bookmaker with principles, a deacon who hated the underworld but hated broken promises more, suggested bringing the harmed families together quietly to redistribute whatever could be recovered. Once that idea took hold, the rest assembled itself. Harlem had always known how to turn money into ceremony when it needed to cleanse something ugly. Red was summoned, though summoned is perhaps too grand a word. In some versions, he was invited through an intermediary with one sentence: if you want to keep breathing in this city, bring everything. In others, he was told nothing except an address and a time. One version says he almost refused until a downtown car slowed beside him and a man he did not recognize leaned out just enough to say, "If you don't go uptown, you won't need luggage." Whether the threat came from Harlem, downtown, or both doesn't matter. By then, both worlds were pressing him toward the same table. And that is how he arrived in the basement where we began. He had not been beaten there. That's another part of why the story shocked people. No swollen face. No dragging chains. No theatrical evidence of street justice. Just Red, dressed more modestly than usual now, carrying satchels full of money with the posture of a man carrying his own organs outside his body. The room was already full. Miss Evie was there. Mrs. Tolbert too. Two old men who had once worked collections under Bumpy when Dutch Schultz was still a threat and Harlem's underworld had a different temperature. A pastor who disliked almost everyone present but believed in debts being honored. Miss Pearl from the luncheonette, arms folded. A couple of boys posted by the door, not as muscle exactly, but as witnesses from the next generation. And on the far side, not seated at the head like some cartoon judge, just present in the room's bloodstream, was Mamie. That detail always matters in the story because it kept the moment from turning into mere criminal ritual. Mamie's presence gave it weight of another kind. Dignity. Memory. The personal cost behind the mythology. She wasn't there to shout or to plead. She was there because what had been broken touched her household too, and because betrayal of Bumpy was never just organizational. It was domestic. It entered kitchens. It entered prayers. It entered the private rooms where women are forced to live with the consequences of male ambition and male cowardice alike. Red set the satchels on the table. Nobody moved to help him. He looked once toward Mamie, maybe hoping for some bridge back to human scale. If so, he found none. "Is it all there?" one of the old men asked. Red nodded. "More." "More from where?" He hesitated. "From me." Miss Pearl gave a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Now it's from you." He opened the bags with stiff hands and began laying out the stacks. That sight alone stunned Harlem later when people retold it. Not because money was rare in criminal rooms. Because this money was no longer criminal in the usual sense. It had changed meaning. It was restitution. Evidence. Condemnation. A traitor's confession without the softness of words. Stack after stack went down under the lights. Nobody touched it at first. Finally the pastor stepped forward and began counting with another man, each band broken, each bundle verified. Red stood there hearing his own greed translated into civic relief. Every pile named back into dignity. This one to Harris's daughter. This one to Mrs. Tolbert. This one restores the prison wives line. This one covers arrears. This one goes to the medical bill. This one. The money had returned to the neighborhood, and in returning, it had changed sides against him. That was the genius of Bumpy's answer. A more ordinary boss would have taken the cash back into the machine and called it revenge. Bumpy, whether by direct order or by the exact kind of moral engineering Harlem believed him capable of, made the repayment visible. He made the neighborhood watch greed become obligation again. That is what shocked them. Because people had expected death. Instead they saw hierarchy, ethics, power, and public shame braided together in a way they had not anticipated. At one point, as the counting went on, Red tried to speak. "I made a mistake." Nobody answered. He tried again, louder. "I said I made a mistake." This time Mamie looked at him. And the whole room felt it. Not because she moved dramatically. She barely moved at all. But her gaze held a tired clarity that stripped every excuse down to the bone. "A mistake," she said, "is turning left when you meant to turn right." Red's face tightened. She continued. "You priced people. That's not a mistake." No one had anything better to add after that. The count took a long time. Money always takes longer when it is being transformed into memory. By the end, all 50,000 was there, plus more, gifts added by Red in desperation, maybe, or borrowed additions to make himself look repentant rather than merely cornered. It didn't help. When the final tally was done, one of the old men nodded once and said, "The house is made whole." Not forgiven. Not healed. Made whole. Those are different things. Red looked around as if waiting for the second half of the sentence. For punishment. For sentencing. For Bumpy's words. For some dramatic finish that would at least let him understand the shape of his own ending. What he got instead was worse. A message. One of the younger men passed a folded note to Mamie. She opened it, read it once, then turned to Red. "He says you can keep your life." The room seemed to tilt. Red actually looked startled. Mamie went on. "He says that's because it belongs now to whatever you can build without Harlem." That line hit the room like cold iron. Because everyone understood at once what it meant. No blessing. No reinstatement. No protection. No door left cracked. No physical execution, because death would have been shorter and perhaps kinder. Exile. In neighborhoods built on recognition, exile is a savage sentence. To be erased from the block that raised you, the stores that knew you, the rooms that once opened without question, the women who knew your mother's name, the old men who remember when you were hungry and helped anyway. There are fates worse than a coffin for men built out of place. Red, to his credit or his horror, understood it instantly. "You can't do that," he whispered. Miss Pearl answered before anybody else could. "Already did." And that was the part that truly shocked Harlem afterward. Not that Bumpy took revenge. Not that the money came back. Not even that the women got paid in front of everyone. It was that he spared Red's blood and took his belonging instead. Some people in the neighborhood hated that decision. They thought it was soft. Thought betrayal this deep deserved a river, a basement grave, a headline nobody could prove. But over time, even many of them admitted the punishment had a colder intelligence to it. Red lived. Which meant he had to carry what he had done into every city after Harlem. He had to explain to strangers why he never went back. He had to live with the knowledge that the one place his name meant anything now carried it only as warning. He had to remember that $50,000, an amount that had seemed large enough to purchase independence, had instead bought him permanent homelessness of the soul. After the basement meeting, he was escorted outside, not roughly, just finally. No one beat him. No one spat. That would have made him feel like a martyr to his own weakness. Harlem denied him even that. People simply watched him leave. And once he did, the block resumed its breathing. That stillness followed him harder than violence would have. In the months after, stories multiplied, as they always do. Some said he went to Philadelphia and tried to start over but found that downtown men had already circulated the right quiet warning. Pays for information, don't tell him yours. Some said he reached Chicago and drank himself into a smaller man. Some said he kept one of the fancy watches and would stare at it when he was drunk, as if time itself had cheated him. Some insisted he tried twice to send letters back uptown and got them both returned unopened. Some say he walked past Harlem years later and did not step off the bus. Whatever became of him physically, Harlem had already settled his true fate. He had been measured. And then removed. That was the lesson everybody kept. As for Bumpy, the story added another layer to the legend growing around him during those prison years. He was still a criminal figure, still dangerous, still impossible to cleanly celebrate without lying about what kind of world he helped build. But the betrayal story gave Harlem something it liked even more than fear. It gave them proof of judgment. Bumpy had not answered greed with frenzy. He had answered it with order. He had taken money bought through selfishness and turned it back into bread, rent, medicine, respect, and neighborhood instruction. He had reminded everybody, from old lieutenants to ambitious young fools, that in his world betrayal was never just about one man crossing another. It was about whether the house still meant anything. That is why the story outlived so many cleaner facts. Not because every detail can be verified line by line. It can't. Not because criminal neighborhoods are reliable archivists. They are not. Not because men like Bumpy deserve simplification into saints. They don't. The story lived because it expressed something Harlem believed about him at his most mythic. That he understood codes deeper than profit. That he knew when money became moral. That he could still reach into the neighborhood from far away and rearrange behavior without touching a door himself. That he knew the difference between punishing a rival and instructing a community. And maybe, too, because people recognized something painfully human in Red. Betrayal stories endure not just because we hate traitors, but because most neighborhoods know a Red. A man who stood too close to power for too long and let proximity become bitterness. A man who told himself he deserved compensation for the loyalty no one applauded properly. A man who mistook being necessary for being loved, and when the distinction finally cut him, chose greed over memory. There was tragedy in that, even if nobody excused it. Bumpy understood tragedy better than people gave him credit for. You don't live that life, with that many funerals and deals and private costs, without learning how close loyalty sits to resentment in the human chest. That may be another reason the punishment took the shape it did. He knew what Red had done was monstrous. He also knew it grew from a soil that underworld life itself helps cultivate. The second man. The waiting man. The man carrying another's kingdom and wondering when the kingdom will finally admit he exists. Still, understanding is not mercy. And Bumpy's answer proved that. He did not say, "I know why you did it." He did not say, "Come back when you're sober." He did not say, "We were brothers once." He restored the house. Then he closed the door. That finality is what gave the story its chill. Because in ordinary revenge tales, the climax is loud. Someone screams. Someone fires. Someone bleeds. Everybody understands the sentence because the sentence is made of blunt objects. Here, the climax was stacks of money under bad lights and a message that did not need to be shouted. You can keep your life. Just not here. That line, or one very much like it, stayed in Harlem like a wind that never fully stopped moving. Older men used it when younger men got too impressed with quick money. Women used the story when explaining why some kinds of betrayal stain not just the hand that takes the cash but the whole kitchen it leaves cold. Even boys who didn't know the full shape of Bumpy's world understood the moral center. Don't sell the house. Not for money. Not for status. Not for the temporary thrill of being seen by men who will despise you once they are done paying. The 50,000 mattered, of course. People always remembered the amount. It was too large to forget. In 1955, it sounded like another life. The kind of money that could trick a man into believing he had become larger than the block that made him. Large enough to turn temptation into philosophy. But that was the beauty and horror of the story. Harlem watched a man trade belonging for money and learned that the exchange rate was cursed from the beginning. 50,000 could buy liquor, rooms, clothes, distance, attention, maybe even a few months of self-deception. It could not buy back a neighborhood once it decided your name had to mean warning. It could not buy trust from men who bought your treachery. It could not buy sleep from the women whose children had gone hungry because you got ambitious. And it certainly could not buy your way back into the shadow of a man like Bumpy Johnson. That shadow, even from prison, was still larger than your future. Years later, people would argue over whether Bumpy personally ordered every part of the restitution or whether Harlem had simply become so fluent in his code that it knew what to do once the line had been crossed. The argument missed the deeper point. Men like Bumpy, when they are at full mythical power, stop needing to choose between direct action and social instinct. They become part of the neighborhood's reflex. That is real power. Not fear alone. Not money alone. Not guns alone. Reflex. The waiter who serves someone last without being told. The barber who says no chair today. The widow who closes the door with truth instead of drama. The old soldier who counts the money straight. The church basement that becomes court because everyone already knows which moral order has been violated. By then Bumpy was more than a man Harlem respected or feared. He was one of the ways Harlem explained consequence to itself. And Red, for one terrible stretch of time, became the example. If you want the final image the way old Harlem liked to leave it, it isn't the basement. Not really. It's later. A station platform. Or maybe a bus stop. Maybe late fall, maybe early winter. Red with one bag that used to suggest freedom and now suggests retreat. A coat good enough to prove the money had been real. A face older than it should be. No one from the neighborhood there to see him off. No last handshake. No farewell from the men downtown either, because buyers of betrayal rarely sponsor the aftercare. Just Red, alone with the full receipt of what he had purchased. And somewhere far away, behind the federal machinery designed to make men smaller than their names, Bumpy Johnson remained exactly what Harlem still believed him to be. Not untouchable. Not pure. Not safe. Not innocent. But still the wrong man to sell. Especially if what you really sold was the house around him. That's why the story never died. Because it offers something more satisfying than a cheap revenge fantasy. It offers hierarchy restored through intelligence. It offers a neighborhood reminding itself that there are lines even criminals are not forgiven for crossing. It offers an emotionally brutal truth too many men learn too late. A person can survive prison. A reputation can survive distance. An empire can survive years if the memory of its code stays alive in other people. But friendship? Friendship, once sold for cash, does not come back as friendship. It comes back as evidence. And in 1955, when Bumpy's friend sold him for $50,000, Harlem didn't just watch one man fall. It watched money lose. That may be the most powerful part of all. In stories about gangsters, money usually wins the scene. It buys loyalty, silence, cars, women, guns, judges, time. It bends people because most people, eventually, have a price small enough to fit into fear or hunger. But this story survived because for once, in the version Harlem wanted to remember, money lost. The cash came back onto the table. The households were restored. The traitor walked away emptied. And the man sitting in prison still ended the whole thing with more authority than the men holding the bills. That's a legend people keep. Not because it proves crime is noble. But because it proves that even in a dirty world, some betrayals are so deep the only proper answer is to show everybody watching that price and value are not the same thing. 50,000 was the price. Everything Red lost after that was the value. And Harlem never confused the two again.